Pranam Da, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I hope you all have a nice cup of tea or coffee since it's Friday, maybe a nice cocktail. Before we start, I just wanted to let you all know that we will be recording today's session, so please do bear that in mind. Also, I advise to maybe keep your cameras and mics off and to turn to speaker view just because it's the best viewing experience for you. You can keep your camera on if you like, but generally it does help to make your connection a bit stronger. So it's completely up to you. I'm Gwyneth Sweetman and I'm the Chair of Public Affairs Cymru, which is Wales's only public affairs representative body. We are a membership organisation speaking for and with those working in the public affairs industry in Wales. I'm also an account manager at Grayling in Cardiff, working in strategic policy and public affairs for a wide range of different clients. This is our third event in the series called the Senedd Election Countdown. So far, we've interviewed some formidable guests, including Rhina Pyorwyth and Angela Burns, interviewing them and asking them your questions in the lead up to the Senedd elections in 2021. The recording of those sessions will be available on our website. Since the 2021 elections aren't miles away, we thought it would be the perfect time to interview the fantastic Jeremy Miles. So thank you, Jeremy, for taking the time to join us today. Clearly, Jeremy is working towards some serious brownie points for the PAC Senedd Member of the Year Award. So I just want to give a little bit of a background to Jeremy's amazing career and life story. So as a Welsh speaker, yeah, I'm gonna go right into detail. So as a Welsh speaker, he was educated in Swansea Valley and New College, Oxford, where he studied law. Straight after graduating, Jeremy taught law at Warsaw University in Poland, which is very cool. Later, he trained as a solicitor in London and held several senior legal and commercial posts in the media sector businesses, including ITV and at NBC Universal. After returning to live in Wales, he set up his own consultancy, working with international clients in the broadcast and digital sectors. He was elected to the National Assembly for Wales and now Welsh Parliament for the Neath constituency in 2016 as a Labour and Cooperative Party candidate. He now holds the title of Counsel General and Minister for the European Transition. His interests, according to his biography, include the economy, community development, education, and skills. He also enjoys films, reading, cooking, hiking, cycling, and following rugby locally. So very active. I'm sure he won't mind us asking him later what his favorite films are. And today he's going to be interviewed by the wonderful Ben Coates. Ben is a senior account executive working at Grayling in Cardiff Bay. He works on multiple different clients across various different sectors, including BT, Public Health Wales, Uber and Cattle. I'm probably a little bit biased since we do work together, but he does have a keen eye for political discourse. He's always got his finger on the pulse and has done some fantastic work for us this year as an events officer for Public Affairs Cymru, serving tirelessly on our committee. And it's also fair to say that since he does work with me in both roles, he does deserve extra praise for putting up with all of that. So before I hand over back to Ben, I just want to say a quick thank you to the committee for working so hard to put all these events together. It's really not easy with everything else that is going on at the moment. And just also to remind you all that our Public Affairs Cymru EGM notice has now gone out. So please do join us at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the 4th of November, to vote on our new constitution, which will hopefully make PAC a lot more accessible to everyone, and also discuss with a special guest to be announced the outcome of the US political elections. So keep an eye out for that, and also the opening of our nominations for our new Public Affairs Cymru Awards, where you'll be able to nominate your colleagues and even your favorite Senedd member. So without many ado, I'm going to hand over back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Gwyn, for the overly generous lies and characterization of my work. And thank you, Jeremy, again for agreeing to speak with us. Before we jump into questions from our members, I thought it would be a good thing for you to provide a bit of background about where Labour's current thinking is with the Senedd 2021 election in mind.
And certainly happy to do that, and thank you for the invitation to join the discussion today. That introduction from Gwyneth was really impossible to live up to, but I'll do my best, obviously. So I have been tasked for some time with coordinating the government's response to the end of the European transition period. So I'll say a little bit about that in a second. Also asked by the First Minister about 6 months ago to help really, again, coordinate a cross-government initiative to identify the longer-term impacts of COVID on economy, public services, community in Wales, and how we could develop jointly on a cross-government basis a set of priorities for responding to that. So just to draw to colleagues' attention, if you haven't yet seen it, about 2 weeks ago we published a document which talks about our priorities really for the remainder of this Senedd term. But you will see from the document many of those challenges are very long-term challenges. So I do think it's probably worth having a look at that if you haven't. The sorts of priorities which you'll be perhaps unsurprised to hear is the focus of the document is around employment, skills and education in particular, with a focus on young people in the labour market. Some very strong commitments in relation to housing, town centre regeneration, very strong commitment to renewables and a green recovery, and a very clear theme of commitment to the foundational economy. I'll come back and say a little bit more about those in a second, but there's a very solid platform of responses to the pandemic, in a longer term horizon really. And the themes which have dominated the work that we've been doing in that space over the summer months in particular have been sort of 3 pillars of work. One has been around economic justice, with a very clear understanding that, as a consequence in particular of COVID, particular cohorts of people have been particularly badly hit economically. So women and young people very much overrepresented in sectors that have been locked down. So particular interventions needed there. And many cohorts have been particularly adversely impacted from a health perspective, members of the BAME community, some older people and so on. So some real, some very specific set of interventions in relation to that. The reason I'm saying that is I think the next Senedd election obviously will be dominated by the effects of responding to the COVID pandemic, dealing with the consequences of leaving the EU transition period probably without a deal of any sort, and quite possibly without, and if there is a deal, not one that's meaningfully helpful to the Welsh economy. And I think the other impact, the other kind of political framing for the next election, I think is evident in the sorts of things we've seen the UK government in particular in the last few weeks pushing very hard. So the UK Internal Market Bill, the broken promises really in relation to the Shared Prosperity Fund. So, a really significant, I would say, assault on devolution really coming from the other side of the M4, which, will I think be a very key theme in the next election. In terms of our work within the party, I'm not myself writing the manifesto, but obviously have been working, as I say, on the balance of this term, which is the bridge, if you like, into that. We've been, as a party, obviously consulting on manifesto development and policy development in advance of the election, just to sort of give a sense of some of the themes that have been emerging in those sort of broad discussions at this point. Clearly, on the economy, on transport, a real focus, as you would expect, on green growth, on decarbonising manufacturing, on making sure we can claim a larger piece of the pie in terms of UK research and development, not least with the UK government's commitments to expand that. What more can we do to drive the impact of the economic contract and the particular focus which we'll see before the end of this term on social partnership with the bill that obviously we've been working on in government, how we make the Fair Work Commission recommendations feel even more substantive. I think a very, I hope, very creative set of discussions around regional economic development in Wales. Colleagues may have seen the piece of work the OECD have done recently, so there'll be a response to some of that in the coming weeks, actually. And I think there are some very creative, very challenging ideas in there about how we make regional economic development genuinely regional. So there are decisions being taken, obviously at Cardiff Bay, but at regional level as well. So I think that's a very kind of creative space for us. Obviously, an ongoing commitment on the foundational economy and better jobs closer to home agenda that we've been working hard on for the last 4 years. I think clearly in the context of leaving the transition period, there will be a need to focus on supporting our exporters in Wales to maintain the foothold in international markets. And I think some interesting discussions that we could have about the development bank, and that's done really good stuff. Is there more than it can do? So I think some very kind of creative stuff in that space. On a kind of transport front, I mean, I think this is probably overshadowed to some extent by the developments of this week, but you'll have also seen the work that Ken Skates is leading on in terms of, I think, a genuine transformation of the bus sector, which is obviously a bit of a Cinderella sector for many, but, you know, for anybody who's elected in Wales, absolutely is the kind of core challenge in public transport terms. Some very interesting stuff we've been talking about, extending pilots in the demand responsive public transport space around buses and so on. So some interesting things, I think, to look out for there, as well as obviously continued commitment to active travel. I think I mentioned town centres earlier, a very, very clear, really strongly emerging set of concerns and priorities within the government, which I hope will be continued in the manifesto. I'm sure it will be, around town centre regeneration. You may have seen some of the ambitions that we've talked about in terms of working with local government around strategic sites in town centres, green spaces in town centres, what we can do to locate health facilities and health and care facilities in town centres. We've talked a bit about some endoscopy services in the middle of town, so really kind of trying to reimagine many of our town centres. So I think that will be a very creative space in the next election, I think. Obviously, you know, with the public health crisis that we've had, there'll be a clear focus, obviously, on the health and care sectors. I think some very interesting discussions to be had around extending the digital offering in health, obviously going hand in hand with, you know, a serious commitment to digital inclusion. I think actually that'll be a significant question across public services coming off the back of COVID into the next election. There's some money going into leadership in public services in Wales, both at the local government level, UK government, Welsh government level, and we hope health and social care as well, to really help with that digital transformation. And I think there needs to be, you know, a very creative set of discussions around that. I think we've learned a lot about, you know, the role, well, we've known obviously already, but it's become even more highlighted, the role of unpaid carers in the functioning of the health and care economy, if you like. So I think there's more that can and should be done there. So I think that's probably a sense of where we are on that side of things. In terms of education, you know, clearly focusing on the education infrastructure, parity of esteem, obviously a continuing focus, investment in the poorest pupils as well in terms of PDG access grant and so on. Clearly, you know, implementing the new curriculum is going to be in schools, at least, you know, a dominant theme in the next term. But I think a lot of other discussions around support for the profession, around training in the context of the curriculum, but also more broadly, and continued support for school leadership in particular, which, you know, becomes obviously increasingly important. I think, you know, we will have seen a lot more of the need to mental health in schools in the last 6 months or so. Certainly see that at a constituency level. So I hope there'll be some, you know, opportunity to do something there. Personal learning accounts, obviously we've been piloting that. There's some themes you will have picked up in the COVID reconstruction work around a commitment to lifelong learning, which I'm personally pleased to see that being talked about, you know, more and more, and also about youth apprenticeships, which is also a theme in the document I mentioned earlier. As I said, one of the 3 pillars for the post-COVID work has been a green recovery, and I think, you know, in the kind of discussions we've been having, you know, at a kind of conference level in the party, some of that discussion has been about how we mobilise a broader sense of public engagement with the climate emergency, so that it's a kind of, new ways really for people to have a sense of agency around that. And I think there are some very interesting lessons to learn through COVID about people's increasing understanding of the mix of personal agency, activist government, the role of science, and how crucial it is to kind of, you know, prepare for these things. So I think myself, there's some very creative space we can build on there. Interest obviously in community and public energy infrastructure, clearly focus on renewables, in particular perhaps around some of the marine opportunities we haven't been able to fully take advantage of. coming out of the EU, obviously environmental regulation is going to be a key theme, how we develop that in primary legislation in Wales. On the primary legislation front, obviously the clean air legislation is obviously still a commitment. And then on the kind of biodiversity side of things, I think the idea of the national forest is really capturing the imagination. So I think kind of ambition in that space will be essential. Happy to talk a bit more about some of that as well. Just one thing on them, which I picked up very strongly in the post-COVID work that we've been looking at, is how you properly reimagine the rural economy through the framework of kind of innovation, really, which is, I think we often talk, don't we, in terms of how do we address some of the challenges in rural economies. And I think there's a kind of positive framing, which is very useful to look at as well, which is what's the role of innovation in sustaining the rural economy. And I think we've learned a bit about remote working and distributed workplaces in the last few months, which I think offers some very interesting kind of, creative thought there. Just finally, I just want to say something about equalities and something about housing. So on the equalities front, whether it's the race equality plan that we've been developing and in light of COVID, whether it's the socioeconomic duty, which we hope to implement before the next election, and I think the gender equality review provides a platform for some significant further work in terms of gender equality. On the housing front, you'll have picked up, I think, and I'll end on this, in the reconstruction document, I would say a very strong focus on the role of housing, both as an economic sector, the role of housing as a stimulus, but also in terms of an environmental contribution, and in terms of tackling fuel poverty. There's some very interesting thinking going on there. A very clear commitment to developing the modern methods of construction sector, so modular off-site housing, capable of meeting targets very rapidly by deploying that, and also achieving environmental objectives. I think a role for co-ops and mutuals in the housing space as well, which I think has been a long-term ambition, and I think hopefully will be an opportunity to expand that. I think lastly on the housing front, and the work that Julie James has been doing on this in particular has this as a strong theme. The idea of place building through housing policy, I think is very important, and I think and hope there'll be something in that space as well. So that's a rather quick sort of rattle through, Ben, of some thoughts, but obviously happy to answer.
Yeah. I don't think there was a subject there that hasn't been raised in a question, so it was well across there. So I think we've done okay. I just want to go back to the 3 pillars in the reconstruction work that you mentioned. I'm just wondering if you could, whilst I understand it's not finalised, and this is very much a bridge to the next manifesto, and the next manifesto is not finalised, I just wondered if you could give us some insight into some more tangible outcomes and actions that the Welsh Government are going to take to underpin those pillars.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you look at the green recovery aspect specifically, you'll see alongside the reconstruction work, Rebecca Evans published details of a £320 million plan. There are already some announcements in there around biodiversity commitments and green housing in particular, but we've also indicated that we want to develop some pilots around the use of solar energy in the health estate, investment in hydrogen hubs, for example, and expanding the commitments that we've made in relation to public sector energy efficiency and decarbonisation. So some very kind of specific things in that space to build on what we've been doing already, really. So, but the key, really, obviously, in that space is that it's it isn't, as it were, limited to a set of environmental interventions. It's a kind of theme across the whole response. So, in terms of business support into the future, I think an increasing focus on using that to drive decarbonisation. So, distinguishing between, as it were, green jobs, which you might describe in a kind of very narrowly focused way, with investing in jobs in long-term sustainable sectors, so that you're but using business support to drive that kind of decarbonisation in those sectors. So I think there's some sectors of manufacturing that particularly need that kind of support. So I think there's some very specific initiatives in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the OECD report in your introductory remarks, and I just wondered how Labour will develop its placemaking approach to the economy, in the next term. And do you see the city deals, for example, being the drivers for that regional thinking and that regional approach, or could you just expand on your thinking there?
Well, I mean, I think the city deals obviously have a important part to play in that, and they're a kind of collaboration, obviously, between different layers of government and the private sector. So they have a particular model of their own. But our vision as a party for regional economic development is much broader than that. So over the course of the last couple of years, maybe even 3 years at this point, there's been a very significant piece of work going on with stakeholders, private sector, local authorities, universities, third sector, and so on, to develop a sort of alternative framework to the framework that we've been living with during our membership of the European Union. Obviously, there's greater flexibility, naturally, post-EU transition, in terms of how programmes can be designed. So obviously one restriction which will no longer be with us is the geographic restriction of West Wales and the Valleys and East Wales and so on. So there'll be much more fluid kind of basis for geographic spread. And then from a kind of principles point of view, a commitment to 4 priorities. One is decarbonisation, one is jobs and growth productivity, one is healthy communities and inequalities. So, sort of a framework for looking at intervention. But I think from a structural perspective, what the OECD have been telling us, the report was published at this point, but essentially the framework needs to recognise devolution, as it were, within Wales as well as to Wales. So, the ambition would be to have a Wales-wide framework for those things which work at the kind of economies of scale level on a Wales-wide basis, but a very strong commitment to regional decision-making as well, and not, as it were, limited to implementation, but investment decisions as well at a regional level and a local level beneath that, indeed, as well. And I think a recognition that that involves building capacity as well. So it's a journey, if you like, but it's one that I think we're keen to do. So, but there'll be a response which will come out in the next few weeks, I think, on that. But I think that gives you a sort of sense of where the direction of travel lies, really.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure we'll all be on this call. We'll be looking out for that. I suppose now I'd probably move towards your portfolio and where that is focused. And as you say, very very possible now that the UK will exit without a deal, or an Australia-style deal. What kind of actions are the Welsh Government taking at the moment to hedge against such an outcome, and to try to mitigate any impacts there?
Oh, I mean, the perhaps obvious point to make is that it isn't possible to mitigate the damage that will cause. What we can do really as a government is a range of things. We will be publishing, I think, in the next few weeks, a end of transition plan which will describe what we have been doing and what we will continue to do, both on a Wales-wide level as a Welsh Government, but also working with the UK Government on a range of other UK-wide responses. Some of that is around ports and borders, some of it's around continuity of supply in terms of food and medicines coming over the borders and so on. So the kind of macro UK-wide interventions. But in terms of specific preparations, I think we are very anxious about the level of third-party readiness in the economy in terms of the capacity of businesses to engage with the prospect of the end of transition. So we're trying to do as much as we can in that space. But as with everything else, as with everybody else, in fact, the current dominant framing for all our lives is the continued response to COVID, isn't it? And it's hard to imagine how, if you're running a business which has had most of its staff on furlough, you can be expected to create the headspace and management time and resource to be able to contemplate the end of transition, not least when you ask the question, what will it look like? Honestly, the answer at this point is it's not entirely clear. So, but we are absolutely clear that we want businesses to try and address that, at least as a kind of recognition that choice is imminent. We have been doing a lot of work around making sure that the ports on the western seaboard of Wales are in the best possible position. So that has required a lot of joint working with the UK government, which, without wishing to be particularly political about it, has not been what it needs to be for a very long time, but is now getting better, which is obviously positive, although somewhat overdue. But it's quite complex because there are a range of devolved and reserved responsibilities at play, and there's a whole interplay of how that sits against the Northern Ireland Protocol and so on, which is very complex. So, but that I think is getting towards a better place. But the timescales for sorting that out are very punishing, and there's, I would say, a very serious delivery risk around being able to get that to where it needs to be on time. The other big question, which is not really addressed very visibly, but and it's a bit, on the face of it, a bit nerdy, but it's absolutely essential, is the question of data, which we don't really hear talked about very much, but obviously we all know how essential it is to running our businesses and organisations. The prospect of data adequacy arrangements, which is the kind of mutual recognition, if you like, with the EU, is very, very well, it's I think pretty unlikely that that'll be in place, to be honest. And some recent decisions of the European Court of Justice have made it harder for some of the fixes to be depended upon. So it's just a plea really to organisations to make sure they understand the implications of that for their business and organisations, really. So some of it is very sort of, technical, as it were, but actually is essential. The other, I mentioned at the start, the other key concern that we have that we're working very hard on is to ensure, together with the UK government and other devolved governments, the continuity of food supplies and medicine supplies, which obviously depends principally on friction at the ports, clearly. But obviously once within the UK, then there's a whole set of discussions going on around making sure there's equitable distribution of those resources across all parts of the UK, basically. So those are some of the key things that we're working on. But as I say, probably in a couple of weeks, there'll be a document which will have a list of interventions that we're looking at, and we'll be telling people where we are on them to the extent that we know that based on the state of negotiations at that point.
Yeah, so you talked initially about getting that message across. Given that some people, some proportion of the public aren't quite clear on what lockdown measures are going to be in place from 6 p.m. today, how difficult of a challenge will it be to get that cut through of that message on top of a national lockdown? And who knows where we will be with this virus in months?
Well, I mean, it's bound to be very, very difficult, isn't it? I mean, it was difficult anyway because of a sense, I think, of, and who can blame people really, but a sense of exhaustion with anything to do with Brexit and the departure from the EU. That was before this new and huge set of challenges we've all been living with for the last 6 or 7 months. I mean, I think what we can do is two things really: make available the information so that people, can find an authoritative source of guidance when they need reassurance or information. And we are continuing to develop our Preparing Wales Paratoi Cymru website, which we launched, I think, probably coming up to 2 years ago, 18 months ago at this point. So that will be, it's continuously updated. There's a particular business tool on there for businesses to check their readiness and to get resources signposted to them. And generally, we've tried to be pretty pragmatic on that. So where there are resources that the UK government have published, for example, which are applicable in Wales, then we'll signpost to those as well. So, to make sure there's the richest source of information, really. So that'll be, as it were, an authoritative place for people to go and find it. But that's not exactly the question that you're asking me. The question you're asking me is, how do you get attention for that? And I think we do what we can with the comms channels available to us, and I hope use our, really well-established stakeholder networks to cascade messages out, certainly to parts of the economy and parts of public services and so on, through those very established channels of communication. I think that's, my own experience at this time last year when we were all preparing for a no deal of any sort departure. I think those networks really came into their own, to be honest. And obviously it's a slightly, the position has changed a year on, hasn't it, in terms of the set of arrangements we'll be leaving with. But I think those networks are still very important for getting the message out.
You've indicated that the relationship between yourselves and the UK government hasn't been the best relationship working. I think, with Andy Burnham making the headlines in the North, what's your take on the future of devolutionary framework in England? How that's playing out with your colleagues in Greater Manchester, for example?
Well, I mean, it's obviously it's for them to comment on whether it works for them, plainly, but it seems to me inherently unstable, isn't it? And there isn't what you would regard as a solid basis for devolution, because you cannot have a situation where you've got the sort of last-minute negotiation around funding, which we've seen play out in the last few days and weeks, which is, whatever you think of the merits of the situation, is obviously not the right way of doing it. I think that the problem is that there is a UK government in its current incarnation, which is an incredibly centralising government in all sorts of regards. I read, I think this week, although I've not researched it myself, but some suggestion that Grant Shapps had suggested to Sadiq Khan that they might take over Transport for London into the central government if there wasn't a sort of set of responses from the mayor, which, I think if you're talking about that kind of thing in the capital, it indicates a slightly broader mindset. Certainly in Wales, and I'm sure the other devolved governments would say the same. Since the Johnson government came into power, there's been a definite rowing back on the extent to which the devolved governments are engaged in UK-wide decisions where devolved competences are involved. Now, there are two big settings for that, and at the moment there's EU transition and there's COVID, and you will have heard us all say, I think, in the government that the level of engagement across the two is unsatisfactory. And obviously, we obviously have a different political position, plainly, but we are a government that believes that the union should work, and should work certainly better than it works now. So we want to put in place a better set of relationships, really, but I don't think there's any enthusiasm really at the UK government end for that. What I would say, I think, is that alongside things that we are seeing, specific things, which is the UK Internal Markets Bill, which obviously is a significant has significant inroads into devolution, but also on the Shared Prosperity Fund. There are other examples of good joint working. So it's not a. I don't want to be giving the impression it's entirely negative, and that's why it's so immensely frustrating, really.
This might be a tricky one to answer, but do you think that there's a sense that Labour might be a more pragmatic unionist party, whereas Plaid Cymru would be the more staunch nationalist party, and the Conservatives, with a more ideologically justified approach to unionism? Do you think that Labour is sort of in a tricky place in between those two?
Well, I think if this is what ideological commitment to the union looks like on the part of the Conservatives, it isn't manifesting itself in anything real on the ground. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, perhaps that is the right sort of broad characterization. Obviously, from my personal point of view, certainly is that the current devolution settlement is, clearly at risk when you've got a UK government that doesn't observe the principles of it. And I think what that tells me is that we need a devolution settlement which is strengthened and better embedded and works on a basis of, the kind of language we've been using recently is around four nations governance, isn't it? Which I think is a subtly different concept to devolution, but I think a better concept, really. We've put forward very pragmatically. I think you said pragmatic unionists. We've put forward very pragmatically, I think, a set of pretty substantial reforms to that. So we are. I don't think, personally, and I don't think Welsh Labour is remotely a kind of party of the status quo when it comes to the union. It's a party of quite radical change to it, I would suggest, but obviously not the kind of change that Plaid Cymru would want to see, for example.
Entirely fair. I think to step away from your portfolio a bit now, just because we've got some more questions that we need to get through. Sure. Betty Cadwaladr, University Health Board, has been under direct control of the Welsh Government for 5 years in special measures. When we interviewed Rhun ap Iorwerth two weeks ago, we learned that Plaid Cymru is proposing to split the Health Board in two. The Welsh Conservatives have pledged to address the challenges at the Health Board within the first 12 months of a Tory government in Cardiff in 2021. What do you think of these proposals, and what is Labour's approach to the Health Board at the moment to get them out of special measures?
Well, I mean, continue the kind of interventions that Vaughan Gething has been championing there. Really, obviously, there's a set of challenges, but I think that the NHS across Wales has been doing a remarkable job in the last few months. Really, I'm not myself sure that the kind of structural response is the right response. I think it's a question of stepping up the kind of reforms that have been going on for some time in North Wales, and I think they will bear fruit. They will bear fruit.
In the first lockdown, there was quite a significant emphasis on physical exercise during, to produce good health outcomes. That messaging seems to not really have come through in this current duration of lockdown. What would the next Welsh government do to ensure there's the real step change in ensuring that there are active communities?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that I think it's right to say that there's a different approach. Well, I mean, it isn't right to say there's a different approach in this lockdown. I think to the extent that you're right, it's because at the start of the last lockdown, I think, we went from a position where exercise was quite constrained, wasn't it? And there was a kind of move which obviously reflected public appetite for it, but also, kind of growing understanding really of how absolutely essential it was for health and mental health. And I think, to the extent it hasn't had the same focus this time, it's because we've recognised that and put in place the kind of broader set of arrangements from the start, really. But the strong message from us is really, to continue to exercise absolutely as much as possible in the coming 2 weeks for reasons that are obvious. But I think the broader point you're making, I think you'll have seen some of the interventions we made around active travel, for example, coming off the back of the first lockdown. I think there's definitely an appetite to drive that agenda forward as part of a kind of broader strategy to encourage exercise as much as anything else.
Okay, well, to shift from health to social care for briefly, the Welsh Government announced introduction of the £1 million carer support fund. Given that 55,300 people in Wales currently receive a carers allowance, 40% of carers say they're concerned about their financial situation. Do you think the carers support fund provides sufficient support in its current form, and is there any plans to expand that fund?
Well, I think the support is an important contribution, I think, to recognising the pressures that carers are under. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, really the role that unpaid carers have played in the last few months has been, highlighted for a lot of people how fundamentally dependent our care system is on that level of care. Now, I think that's been obviously well understood for some time, but I think it's part of, in looking at the social care system and how that needs to be reformed. And you would probably have seen that that's one of the things which we've identified, obviously, in the post-COVID reconstruction work. And Julie Morgan's already taking forward some work on this. So I think the role of carers in that is obviously absolutely essential. And I think, more to be done in terms of implementing the carers' rights agenda through the existing legislation that we've got on the statute book in Wales, to make sure that, as well as, providing for the needs of those who are cared for, making sure that the assessments that carers have a right to are delivered in a way which is meaningful and gives the opportunity to support them in their needs as well. I think there's, more to be done in implementing that legislation.
Because we're moving on to audience questions now, there's going to be a little bit of not so much fluidity as perhaps I've tried to achieve so far. What happens? What lessons has the Welsh Labour government learned in 2020, and to what extent will these lessons shape policy development in 2021? Should Labour win a majority?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we've tried to learn some of the lessons in the response that we've published already. I mean, that's a sort of emerging set of conclusions, isn't it? So I think the first thing to say is, if you look at that document, the sort of focus that we have on, the 8 priorities, they were ones which were developed necessarily in the context of the transmission of the virus reducing. So we obviously aren't in that place now. So the context for all of that is different. But I think clearly the impact of the virus has been unequal, both in terms of health inequalities and in terms of economic inequalities. Now, obviously, those are not new challenges, but they are, very much intensified, if you like, as a consequence of COVID. So there's some specific things which need to be addressed there. But I think as well, the key, well, not the key, but certainly the most recurring theme, which has arisen in the various kind of consultation discussions that we've had in terms of the best response to COVID, that question of intergenerational fairness has been absolutely central to that, and particularly, certainly in terms of long-term impact, the need to address the particular needs of people in the kind of 16 to 24-year-old cohort who, might be entering the job market for the first time this year, next year, and will obviously be finding that, in many cases, very, very hard going. So I think a specific set of interventions to support work and skills for people in that cohort. And I think, frankly, as well, one of the things we've been told repeatedly, and it's not surprising to hear, is that the biggest contribution you can make as a government to protecting the long-term interests of that group of people is to make sure that for those who want to stay on in education, that they're able to do that for as long as possible, really, because that obviously will stand them in better stead. So there's specific things, I think, around that. I think some real lessons, I guess, around the role of community infrastructure and town centres. I mentioned at the start, clearly the transforming towns work that Hannah Blythe was leading on anyway. I think the focus on that will be very much more intensive now. And I think some very good, positive proposals coming out already about how we can take some of that forward. I mean, the real challenge strategically in the long term for that is that, much of our town centre kind of infrastructure and fabric is dominated clearly by retail. And because of the growth of online and the growth of out of town retail, the pressure on retail as a sector in town centres has been, immense for some time, as we all know. And what one would expect to see happening, I think, is for the balance between that and kind of leisure and hospitality in town centres to change over time. Now, the challenge that we currently have, of course, is that both those sectors are under huge pressure as a consequence of COVID. So, managing that transition is, even more challenging in that context. But I definitely think that's been highlighted, really. What struck me in doing this piece of work over the summer is, alongside this response, the programme for government has obviously been continued to be implemented. And if you were to say to me at one point, these challenges, if you look at the 8 priorities, most of them aren't new priorities in a sense, most of them aren't new challenges at least. But I think, they've become even more pressing and they require, and I think the public appetite for solving them has become greater as well, actually. I think that's important to note. And so, and also the ways of solving them are different now post-COVID. So just to stay on town centres for a second, we've got a target now to encourage people to try and get 30% of people to work remotely from home or remote from the office for at least part of the time, which is a significant target. We think it's probably manageable within about a year after the end of COVID, whenever that comes, in terms of that kind of horizon of stabilisation when we have the virus under control. You can imagine getting towards that target. But that will have serious implications for public transport, for town centres and so on. So one of the possible opportunities here, which I think is very exciting, is the development of town centre remote working hubs. So, rather than having to commute from top of the Swansea Valley to Cardiff, you could commute from top of the Swansea Valley to Pontardawe or to Neath, for example, which, and work remotely from there. So I think there's some new opportunities, if you like, that's come off the back of COVID, which help solve some of those longer term challenges as well. The last thing I think, sorry Ben, I'll stop speaking. And the last thing is on the green side of things. I think that it's a long-standing commitment, obviously, but I think what we must not get is a narrative where you have kind of economic stimulus on one hand, which is obviously going to be essential, and sustainability on the other. We've got to find a way of marrying those two things, really, and I think that's part of the work that we've been doing.
More than reasonable. Just quickly, do you think that the Welsh Government, you've said that Labour isn't a status quo in regards to the level of devolution. Do you think that you have the policy levers to achieve all your outcomes at the moment? And if not, if you were to pick one area where you would need to, for example, in probation or something like that, how can you, what devolutionary settlement is required for Welsh Labour government to achieve its goals?
So I'm personally very clear that we don't have all the levers that we need in order to be able to deliver the outcomes that we want. I guess the one area that is nearest my my heart, if you like, my role certainly, is the devolution of justice, because I think that it's an anomaly. If you look at public services, they are largely devolved. The exception is the justice system and policing, which is clearly, very, very significant part of the public service. So, and I think what we have seen, actually, to use the last few months as an example, if I may, is a growing understanding, I think, on the part of people in Wales who may or may not have been particularly interested in devolution or the way government works or politics at all, really. But I think by virtue of the greater visibility that the lunchtime press conferences and so on has created, I think that has been good for democracy in Wales because it's made it clearer who's accountable for what, which is obviously good. But it's also, I think, given people a sense of the capacity of devolution to deliver things in a different way, in a way which works best for Wales. Now, obviously, there's a political discussion, which I'm sure people are having about whether the particular interventions are right, but, leave that to one side. Obviously, think they are, but, it is good for people to know who's making the decisions and that different decisions are capable of being taken. But I think if you look at how the justice system has played into that in the last few weeks and months, what we have seen is a high level of collaborative working, actually, between Welsh Government, the police, the prison service, the court service, the probation service, all of those otherwise reserved agencies. And the joint working has been good, but it has been good because of individuals overcoming barriers in the system, basically. So, this has been a time when the link between public health and housing and the justice system, just to name a couple of touch points, really, has been absolutely fundamental. And it will have been easier to do that if you have a set of kind of devolved, authorities working together, really. So I do think that has shown what a bigger opportunity there is to get better outcomes if we were able to devolve justice and policing to Wales.
Yeah. You mentioned housing in that response. Like you said, I think the COVID pandemic is, we've seen the value of having a home, and, everyone should have the dignity of a safe and secure place to call home. What more can you say about the priorities or the ambition of the Welsh Government post-2021 in relation to the delivery of new social homes and ending homelessness, just like the interventions you're discussing there?
Well, my own view is that one of the key things that we've been able to do in the last few weeks is to take people off the streets, really, into accommodation. Now, there's a sort of phase, there's a second phase of that now to make sure that those people are, housed in the longer term rather than in the temporary arrangements that they have now. And I think it has set an ambition for us to do even more in terms of being able to intervene to support people who are homeless and to take them off the streets. I think in terms of housing more broadly than that, there is an existing commitment as of the last few weeks to put more money into the social housing grant, into the innovative housing programme and the optimised retrofit housing programme, which will significantly extend both development but also obviously energy efficiency, and alongside that to support SME house builders in Wales in particular to develop sites for further housing development through putting more capital into stalled sites funds and other property development funds which the Welsh Government offers, so that we can support SME house builders in particular to develop those sites. So, a very strong ambition. I myself think that if you read that document, the thing which comes across most clearly from it is a commitment to housing and green housing in particular. And I think that's for kind of obvious reason, really. We've seen how, how the inequality, if you like, in housing experience has been playing out in the last few weeks and months. I think if you look into the next Senedd term, I was thinking about this in advance of a committee appearance I did yesterday, looking at the COVID reconstruction work. And I think the estimate is that in order to meet housing need in the next Senedd term, you'd need to be building about 3,500 social housing need, by the way. You need to be building about 3,500 social units a year through that term. So that's the kind of scale of the challenge, really, to meet that social housing need.
Well, so something with that kind of scale requires, the capital investment to underpin that. Given the growing strain on public finances caused by COVID-19, what is Labour likely to do on taxation in 2021, should you get a majority? Is there room, for example, for targeted tax incentives to encourage investment, given we've had almost a year of low levels of investment from business?
Well, the first obvious point to make, I think, is that it's going to be a theme in the next election in a way that it hasn't been in previous elections. I think we have demonstrated that where we have tax powers, we have been able to use them in ways which are bespoke to Wales and reflect the circumstances in Wales. Obviously, there's a kind of ongoing discussion in the public sphere about income tax powers and so on. You'll have heard the First Minister's response to that. It depends very much on the kind of economic climate at the time. I think the challenge that you're talking about, though, Ben, which is kind of investment in the economy at large, it is a challenge which is not even, it's a global challenge. I think the prospect for, businesses across the globe, I think there's going to be an investment challenge for some time as a consequence of COVID, and it's probably going to be more intense in the UK as a consequence of the EU transition. I think that requires a UK government-wide response. It's, that's the scale of the challenge for us in the UK. And I think we just, whatever levers we have whatever fiscal levers we have at our disposal in Wales in our current settlement, the truth of the matter is they are outweighed by the capacity, obviously, of the UK government. And so we need to have a different approach. I would suggest coming out of COVID, pretty fundamentally different approach to fiscal stimulus more broadly into the future.
I've got a question on the social partnership agenda next. It's a tripartite partnership between government, trade unions, and employer bodies. Is this a slightly outdated 1970s approach, ignoring the developments in the third sector and the wider civil society, who are also social partners? Could you just give a bit more detail on that, please?
Yes, well, obviously it's a key commitment the First Minister made in his leadership manifesto to bring forward a social partnership bill, which we obviously are going to do. I don't think that tells us that is not a return to the 1970s. I think it's the way that modern economies should work, and well-functioning modern economies do work. And I think that it also, by the way, reflects the practice of the Welsh Government since devolution, really, in terms of having a mature, collaborative discussion set of relationships, both with employers and in the private and public sectors and the unions. The role of the third sector is absolutely essential. I think we've seen that, haven't we, in the last few months. I think that we would not have been able to take forward the response that we have without the third sector. I think that there's there's obviously a very well established set of relationships with the third sector and has been throughout this period. And we've, I think one of the very early things that we did was to make available funding specifically for the particular risks the third sector faced because of, kind of structures, if you like, and long-term resilience challenges in parts of the third sector. So I think we were pretty quick off the mark, really, in terms of making some funding available. I dare say our colleagues in the third sector would have wanted more support, clearly, but for reasons I understand. But I think it demonstrates that commitment is very, very live in the Welsh Government.
Thank you for that. Because we've only got a bit of time, I think we'll have to keep the questions responses brief. But I think, how might Labour rethink further on higher education post-COVID? Given that the tertiary education research bill is another victim of that COVID-19 response in terms of bill,
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is, yes, it was a victim of that, and that's very unfortunate. And I really very much hope that will be able to be brought back by the government in the new, by the new government in the new Senedd term. You'll have seen in the priorities document we published, recognition of the long-term need to, restructure really further and higher education. That is best done, I think, when you've got the kind of legislative platform which the bill would have provided. I think a real emphasis on growing vocational opportunities and making sure there's a sense of what's the word for it really, regional economic mission, I guess, for our higher education institutions to deliver on their local economies, not simply, as it were, well, I shouldn't put it in those terms at all, obviously as educational institutions, but also as key economic actors in many of the communities and regions that they serve.
So we might see a slightly, a different sort of bill, given the pre-COVID world it was formulated, and it might need to be refined to reflect the post-COVID world.
I'm not sure about that, Ben. If I'm honest, I think that the challenges are, the solutions which that bill offers are solutions to the same set of questions, really. So I think it's about providing a more rational and joined up platform on which to look at some of the relationship between FE and HE. So I think that remains, the bill is, the bill does that job, I think, in a pre or post-COVID world.
Okay, well, as we're going into another lockdown in Wales, I had a couple of promises to myself that I would do and didn't do in the first one, and I'm going to do my damnedest to do it in the second lockdown. Were there any ones that you failed on?
Oh, well, yes, obviously, most of them, but I bought some kettlebells. So my absolute commitment to myself is to try and use those every day, but I'm sure that's not going to happen, frankly, but I'm setting that goal at least.
I've also bought some kettlebells, so we have that in. We'll see how that goes. And finally, Welsh Rugby Union is back. What is the score going to be against the French?
I'm not going to comment on any of that.
I'm scared of the pack myself. So anyway, but yes, well, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you in particular to Jeremy and Gwyn for being with us and sitting down with us. I've been Ben, and have a great weekend, because I'm so ready also. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.